We've talked briefly about microbiomes and behavior a couple times on this podcast, and since I find the potential connection so interesting, I knew I had to bring in a guest that is doing research on this very topic. Sarita Pellowe owns East Coast Canine Dog Training based in Newfoundland, and she joins me for this episode where I get to pick her brain about all things gut biomes and behavior, and you'll hear some really interesting insights and connections. She has a master's in science and is currently enrolled in her second master's degree at Memorial University, this time studying under the Cognitive and Behavioral Ecology program, with her research investigating the links between gut microbiota and anxiety and aggression in dogs. Sarita holds a CPDT-KA, a CBCC-KA, and is currently working towards fulfilling the requirements to become an Associate Certified Animal Behaviorist with the Animal Behavior Society. And if you are enjoying the Bitey End of the Dog, you can support the podcast by going to aggressivedog.com, where there's a variety of resources to learn more about helping dogs with aggression issues, including the upcoming Aggression in Dogs Conference happening from October 11th to 13th, 2024 in Scottsdale, Arizona, with both in-person and online options. You can also learn more about the Aggression in Dogs Master Course, which is the most comprehensive course available anywhere in the world for learning how to work with and help dogs with aggression issues. I also have a wide variety of webinars, upcoming courses, videos, and articles, all from the foremost experts in training and behavior. We are your one-stop shop for all things related to aggression in dogs. Hey guys, welcome back to the Bitey End of the Dog. I am really excited for this week because we're going to be diving into a topic that I don't know much about, but I really want to learn a lot more about, and it's something that is kind of new to the dog training community, which is the gut biomes and behavior. And this week I have Sarita Pellowe, who is joining us and has done a lot of research actually on this topic and is a dog trainer. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you today. This is pretty huge for me.
I'm so excited for you to be here. So I would love to first, for my sake, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners, really dive into the basics of this first so we can get a kind of foundational understanding. So how would you define biomes or gut biomes? What are they and what are their function?
So the gut microbiome in particular is a community of organisms living within the mammalian gut. Some people consider it to be a super organ, and some of the facts and figures around the sheer size of the gut microbiome itself are absolutely outstanding. I've seen comments on the human gut microbiome that the content within there, all of these organisms, can weigh up to 2 kilograms in an adult human being. So it's an amazing amount of life fostered there inside our gastrointestinal tracts. Typically, the gut microbiome itself is made up of upwards of millions of organisms. We're looking likely in the billions and trillions kind of a level of numbers. And the community is made up, it's not just bacteria, and there's also archaea, which are single-celled organisms, fungi, and viruses as well. And when we talk about the gut microbiome in our research, we are specifically referring to the bacteria that are in there. For the most part, these bacteria have a pretty symbiotic relationship with the host, but there are also problematic bacteria in there. They can start to cause issues with gastrointestinal disease. And even those bacteria that we typically consider to be beneficial, if things go out of line in terms of the composition, if we're getting too many of those bacteria, then we can start to see problems in terms of health and disease. So it's a really complex system. There's a lot of back and forth between the gut microbiome and the host in terms of not just health, but we're seeing a lot more evidence for behavior now as well. And those impacts, they can be short-term and they can be long-term as well. So we can see short-term effects in terms of, say, diarrhea, gastric upset. We see big shifts in the composition of the gut microbiome then, but there's also indications that specific bacteria might actually be indicative of an increased risk for certain types of cancer and mental health disorders as well.
That's fascinating. And so a lot of the research now And it seems like everybody's talking about this. Like they're talking, Andrew Huberman's got people on his podcast talking about it. So a lot of studies in humans, but what about dogs or animals for that matter? Is not quite as much research. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a big focus in humans because, mental health is the forefront of everybody's minds right now. And especially since the pandemic, my generation in particular are becoming increasingly aware of taking care of our mental health. In terms of the gut microbiome itself, the entire field, even in the well-studied organisms, humans, it's only really been within the last 15 or 20 years or so that we've seen big advances in the field. And a lot of that is because of the emerging technology that we have. We actually have the computing power now to deal with these enormous data sets that we're getting from the genetic information within the gut microbiome. And we also have the databases too to be able to accurately identify the bacteria that we're seeing. And even now, day after day, there's new bacteria being identified constantly, not just in humans, but in dogs and other mammalian models too, like mice and pigs are also a big area for study. One of the great things about dogs, though, is we're finding more and more that the dog gut microbiome is probably out of all of these mammalian models the most similar to the human gut microbiome. And that's interesting for me because we do share so much of our environment with dogs that it does kind of stand to reason that there would be some similarities given how many environmental factors impact the shape of our gut. And obviously, we're a very different species. We have different dietary requirements, different physiological processes and lifestyles. But sharing such close similarities, it makes dogs a really interesting species to study, especially given that so many of the responses of the gut are so similar between us. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm so excited, well, not just excited to have been able to do it myself, but how the canine gut microbiome field is starting to grow now too.
What got you into that? So you kind of started your research project, which we'll dive into more, but what kind of got you going into, okay, there's this relationship between behavior and the biome. Was it something you saw in the human research, or is it something you were interested in animal research?
So I actually can't take credit for that one because this project was not my idea. The job was essentially posted by our local university. And at the time, I was itching for something to do. It was late 2020. I had recently got my permanent residency here in Canada as well. And there was a lot of insecurity there after the pandemic. We didn't know if we were going to return to life as normal. I wasn't sure if my business was going to thrive or not after everything that we'd been through. So I saw this opportunity to do the master's and I just thought, you know what? Why not? Like now is as good a time as any. I can go back to school for a couple of years. And in my mind, a big part of that driving factor was to then be able to use this master's thesis as a way to gain my ACAB, the Associate Certified Applied Animal Behaviorist designation from the Animal Behavior Society. So it just seemed like, I don't know, the stars aligned in this project coming up. So it was actually proposed by my 3 supervisors at Memorial University here. Dr. Carolyn Walsh is the head of our canine research unit. Carolyn's history is in the behavior side of things. We also had Dr. Dawn Bignell, who's our microbiologist, and then Lourdes Peña-Castillo is our computer sciences wizard. She's literally the smartest person I know. Like the things that she can do with data analysis are just unreal. So they are all scientists here at the university, and they're all big dog lovers as well. And there'd been a paper had recently come out, the Mondo paper, which I believe you covered previously, probably a couple of years back now on your podcast. That paper had just come out. It was a wonderful paper, but it was based in shelter animals. So there was sort of a question there of, okay, so if we know that there's a bidirectional relationship between the gut microbiome and behavior, and we're looking at dogs who are in a potentially stressful environment, how is that going to impact not only the gut microbiome composition, but the behavioral assessment that they're doing as well? So what my supervisors proposed we do was take that study, learn from what they had found, and repeat it in a population of dogs who were living in a more stable environment. So we were aiming for pet dogs who had adult pet dogs in the local area who had more consistent living arrangements. So they've stayed in the same home with the same number of animals we went for over 3 months to be conservative, and had been eating a consistent diet as well. And then we went for a slightly broader scope of behavioral assessment rather than doing in person, which at the time was going to be quite challenging with COVID. It was hard enough for us to get the university to let me go to people's doorsteps and pick up their fecal samples, let alone do in-person behavior assessments. Mm-hmm. So we opted to use the CBERC, and that helps us to get sort of quite a wide profile from a lot of dogs. I think we had initially 494 participants took our first questionnaire, and out of those, around 235 went on to do the CBERC. So it gave us a nice little population to then be able to start selecting people that we could invite for the more in-depth study of actually taking those samples from the dogs.
I imagine it was, during a pandemic, let me go pick up some, like with the whole phobia of germs at the time, let me go pick up some more germs to bring back. I'm sure that was a little bit of a hurdle. So you mentioned CBERC, which is a really robust questionnaire that's used in a lot of studies. And then you mentioned you were looking for dogs that were at least in the home for 3 months. And I think you mentioned, or we had talked earlier too, about the age of the dogs being a certain age, 2 to 7. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And why was that? Why was that particular narrower group of dogs?
So we wanted to ensure that essentially the gut microbiome had settled to its final form in those dogs. So what happens, as far as we know from the limited information we have about the development of the canine gut microbiome, it's rapidly developing from birth through to, we think, about a year old. And then once that dog reaches adulthood, the core composition of the gut microbiome then stays relatively stable. So we can cause shifts in the gut microbiome by adjusting diet. If we supplement with probiotics, if we use antibiotics, we see a big shift there too. But essentially what happens after you stop adding in extraneous factors like probiotics, the gut will then go back and settle to what is considered normal for that individual dog. So we wanted to avoid risking looking at a little snapshot in time with that fecal sample in a dog who was younger and that gut microbiome is still developing. So by setting our age limit from 2 to 7 years old, we are pretty safe in the knowledge that that is the core population for this particular dog. And they're not on the older end of the spectrum where we might start running into age-related changes or potentially underlying disease associated with age that might also impact the gut microbiome. I guess one of the things that we really need to focus on when we're doing gut microbiome research is we're trying to limit as much variability as possible, because behavior in the real world is messy enough. There are so many factors that contribute to the development of behavioral issues in dogs. And then we're looking at an equally complex system, arguably more complex in terms of the gut microbiome. So we want to make sure that when we get our data at the end of the study, that we have accounted for as many potential variables as possible. Age was just one of them, but we also looked at the dog's diet. We looked at their history with using dewormers, with probiotics, and even their body condition score too. So when you see the posters in your vet clinic of the underweight, average, and overweight dogs, we wanted to try and match them as closely as we could there to ensure when we come out at the end, the main thing that separates two dogs when we're looking at them is their behavioral score from CBERC rather than any of these environmental factors.
Got it. So you have these wonderful advisors. They tell you to take on this project, this research project. You go out, you start getting these poop samples and analyzing them. And then you have the CBERC questionnaires as well. So you have that data coming in. What did you start looking for? So let's get into what kind of questions on the CBERC were really focused for this particular study. And then we can talk about, what we're looking in the biomes. But so what kind of information were you going for? And actually you should start with, what was the kind of final sample size for this?
So we were hoping to get 50 fecal samples from this population of dogs. And this is essentially why we needed such a large response to the questionnaires in the first place, is because every time we cut our population down, accounting for all of these variables, that cohort just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And we ended up with, I think it was only around 72 dogs out of that entire population that actually met the criteria to be able to go on to the fecal sampling section. So with those 72 dogs, basically what we did, and the reason why we used CBERC, was we wanted to decide, okay, out of this population that we have who are about as controlled as a community sample can be, out of these dogs here, who's the most aggressive and who's the least aggressive? Who shows the highest signs of anxiety? Who shows the lowest? So essentially how we use CBERC in this particular study is we took the aggression subscales. We used stranger-directed fear, dog-directed fear, and non-social fear. For anxiety, we also included the separation-related issues as well. So we created an average. So it's just sort of an index of how much of a scaredy cat are you? And when you take the CBERC, you can kind of look at it as a sense of, if you get a score of 0, this is not an anxious dog. And then as you go up, we're increasing the severity of it. So we did capture quite a few dogs who were on the higher end of the spectrum, scoring the 3s and the 4s, the more severe aggression and anxiety cases. But the majority of our community sample was down at the lower end, around the 0s, which is kind of nice when we get onto the results to just keep in mind that these are pet dogs and they're pretty normal. And even though they are normal, we're still seeing a very clear pattern in terms of the gut microbiome and the particular bacteria that were associated with behavioral issues. We didn't need a drastically polarized population of heavily anxious and heavily aggressive dogs versus quote unquote normal ones. Even in such a pet basic community, we still saw results. So that's probably one of the more exciting aspects of this research for us is I think we've shown some pretty good evidence that there is a link there.
Can I ask you a little bit more about the CBARC questions in regards to how are people identifying, a dog that's aggressive, air quotes there, or anxious or showing anxiety? Were there any particular measures or body language or behaviors that would classify them?
So it is owner reported. So to a certain extent, it is open to interpretation and the owner's perception of how severe a response is. So as they go through the questionnaire, there's 100 questions and you're presented with various situations. How does your dog respond when they see an unfamiliar person, when they see an unfamiliar dog? For inside the home, there's questions like when your dog is approached by a familiar dog or when they're approached by a person and they've got a bone or a toy or their food. So the owners have to report that in terms of severity. And there are loose examples there in the descriptions for CBARC where they say, 0 is no reaction, no concerns. And as they go up, they do state, lunging and barking as suggestions for typical behaviors that you may see. But for the most part, you're reporting it on what we call a Likert scale. So from 0 of no concern up to 4 for most concerned. And, CBARC has its pros and cons for sure. And I know there are critics out there in terms of questioning the validity sometimes of the questionnaire. For us, we were able to collect a large amount of behavioral data in our questionnaire in this project itself. From doing it with my own dogs. Recently had a presentation where I showed my dog Denzel, who is a very spicy little character. He's extremely dog aggressive. And I had my own concerns too when we first started reading about CBARC and deciding if we were going to use it. So I did it for all 3 of my dogs at the time. And I was pleasantly surprised with how accurate the summary of my dogs was. I'm able to see, I'm a consultant, but I'm also a scientist. So I have a healthy level of skepticism when it comes to the methods that we're going to use. And I do genuinely think that it accurately reflected my dog's personal profile. And we've got to keep in mind too that, no one approach is going to be absolutely perfect. We're going for volume and being able to capture a large amount of data and essentially use behavioral score as a proxy. We don't necessarily need to know the specifics of the behaviors that your dog shows when they're behaving aggressively or when they're in the pits of anxiety. But we did need it to be able to establish this is our less anxious group, this is our more anxious group. I think when you compare it to the in-person behavioral assessments, absolutely, we'd love to be able to validate for every single dog that the CBARC responses were absolutely accurate. But then you get into the issue of time and resources of being able to dedicate that to larger sample sizes as well. Often you've got to take what you can use, the resources that you can use, and just be honest and transparent about the take-home messages that you're getting from that questionnaire. I don't think that CBARC is absolutely perfect, but I do think that it's a wonderful tool when it's understood and used properly.
I agree. I think it's been used in so many different studies, and I think the information that we're getting from those studies is very helpful. So I think the CBARC has been a wonderful tool in academia and research. And so, okay, so now what did you discover? So you get these samples, you got the questions, you identify the dogs that might be anxious or aggressive, and you start to analyze that poop, and you spit it into the supercomputer. You can tell us more about that. And what were the results? What did you discover?
So we ran a multitude of different sort of approaches for this, because one of the big sort of caveats with gut microbiome research at the moment is because it's such a rapidly developing area and technologies are developing all of the time, there is a lot of variability between studies and between methods. So we used multiple different approaches to look at the differences between our higher anxiety, lower anxiety, and higher aggression dogs. And essentially what we wanted to see is when we use these different methodologies, do we have the same bacteria being identified consistently, even though we have different methods of analyzing it? So what we initially found was a little bit sad on my part as a young scientist. You really want to have the significant results. You want those really low p-values and the sexy graphs coming out at the end of it. And what we found when we looked at just the relative abundance of the bacteria in our cohort is that there really wasn't a big difference in the core populations of bacteria when we separated them out by behavioral group. And while it's somewhat disappointing for me seeing that, it does actually confirm that the dogs that we had within our study are just perfectly physically healthy dogs. And based on the other literature that's been published, there was a 2020 paper by Elisabetta Mondo and then another in 2019 by Nicole Kirchhoff. They both said that any differences that we see within the gut microbiome are going to be quite nuanced and subtle differences, likely relationships between a couple of subdominant bacteria, so not the main population, but these small, subtle changes. And when we started digging deeper with the more in-depth analyses that we did, we actually started to have one bacteria that kept getting identified again and again across these analyses. And what's interesting is, well, I wish this was anxiousdog.com rather than aggressivedog.com, because truly for aggression, we really didn't see that many differences between the two populations. But when we split the dogs by anxiety group, we saw one bacteria at the genus level just getting identified over and over again. That bacteria's name is Blautia, and it's a relatively newly identified bacteria that has sort of divergent evidence in the literature for what that bacteria's role is. There's little that we know about it in dogs, but when it's been studied in humans and also in mice, I believe, as well, some state that this genus has probiotic and protective effects, that it's a great bacteria that we want to keep around. But then others have indicated that it might also be indicative of an increased risk of breast cancer, and it's also been associated with autism spectrum disorder in humans as well. So what we have to sort of think about there is, well, it's really exciting that we had a really high level of accuracy within our mathematical models here of essentially our analysis, CellBal, it was called, was able to predict whether or not a dog was in the higher anxiety or lower anxiety group with around 85% accuracy. Wow. Just looking at the specific relationship between our little friend Blautia and two other bacteria, those Oscillosphericia and Negativicutes. So to have 85% accuracy from 48 perfectly average pet dogs was a pretty astonishing finding for us. That's actually really convincing. Obviously, we'd love to have a much higher accuracy for these models, and I think that might be possible if we start to go on and target more clinical dogs, so dogs who really, they're all clustered up around the 3s and 4s on those CBARC scales, I think if we can capture those more intense, the more problematic behaviors, then we might then start to build more evidence and figure out exactly what's going on with this bacteria in these anxious dogs.
And so the question that comes to mind is sort of the chicken and egg argument or conundrum, so do we see in these anxious dogs, which is amazing that you found that common Plautia in these dogs in the anxiety group. What would you say is, for the people listening in, and I know I have this question, is it because these dogs have this anxiety that we're seeing a higher production of that bacteria, or is potentially the bacterium causing some of the anxiety?
I think that's going to be a question that I take to my grave, honestly, because we know there's a bidirectional relationship there, but you're exactly right. It is a chicken and egg relationship. And until we know more about the specific mechanisms, potentially have some longitudinal studies too, to see if, as a dog or as a puppy is developing, if maybe Plautia could be identified as a biomarker for an increased risk group. Again, that's going beyond the scope of what we could say from our study, but I think it's definitely something that bears keeping in mind for future studies, is if this is indicative of an increased risk, it could be used in predictions, but we don't know right now if it is a case of anxiety coming from other sources that's then altering the gut microbiome through stress. One thing I do think our study has sort of made me start to think about around that, though, is where we see bigger differences between the groups based on anxiety, but not with aggression. When I then put my training hat back on and start to think about what does anxiety look like, what does aggression look like, anxiety, I kind of tend to think of as a more chronic condition. It's that ongoing chronic stress, that chronic worry, whereas aggression could arguably be thought of as a bit more context specific. You behave aggressively in X context to get certain desired outcome. So that would make sense if Plautia is more heavily associated with anxiety, if we're seeing more patterns within anxious dogs, that we're looking at more of a chronic condition than potentially with aggression. That being said, the other studies have mostly focused on aggression, and they have some differences too. So again, variability between studies, I would never be so bold as to say that ours is the right way or anything like that, because they provide pretty valid evidence too to say that there's a difference between aggressive and non-aggressive dogs in a couple of different populations now too.
And what was the number or percentage in the aggression group? You had 85 in the anxiety group, but what was the percentage you found in the aggression group?
For the accuracy in predicting the group?
Yes.
For anxiety, in two of the analyses, we had 85 and 87% accuracy. For aggression, when we ran random forest with feature selection, we got 75%.
Okay.
So when you get down to 50%, that's a flip of a coin if the program is going to assign the dog to the correct group.
Right.
So definitely a lot more convincing evidence for anxiety group for us than for the aggression group.
So with that being said, with aggression, you studied it with fear-based stranger issues, dog issues, and dog non-social fear, right? So you're kind of looking at that emotion of fear in the CBAR questions. Were they kind of skewed towards that emotion of fear in the aggressive responses, or was it just dogs displaying aggression?
So we tried to keep the two factors separate, which is almost impossible to do, because when you look at CBARC studies, any of the validation studies, there's evidence in the literature, but also in real life, for so many comorbidities between anxiety and aggression. So what we found with the groupings that we had, we split them on aggression or anxiety. But when we look at the combination of the two, the majority of the dogs that we were comparing were both highly aggressive and highly anxious, compared to not anxious and not aggressive. So the majority of dogs that we had within those groups were essentially the same dogs. There were very few who came out to have low anxiety and high aggression, and conversely, very few that had low aggression and high anxiety. We did see a lot of comorbidity within our sample, that they are you would want to assume exhibiting fear-based aggression, but again, you can't really extract that from the questionnaire and derive the mechanisms for their aggression.
Yeah, because what comes to mind for me is sort of thinking in that gut-brain axis and what happens in the brain when we're talking about the brain. When we think about anxiety, we're thinking about, an emotion or sort of a byproduct of some emotions. But so you think about what's happening in the brain there. But with aggression, when we're like measuring aggression, we're often focused on the outside. We're seeing the barking, lunging, growling. So we might ask a pet owner, what do you see? Do you see barking, growling, lunging? But that could be the cause or the motivation could be from a variety of different emotions. So sometimes we might see like a fear-based aggression, and sometimes we might see a dog protecting a resource, which I argue is often they're starting to teeter into other emotions such as anger or rage, if you're looking at an effective neuroscience model. Or even, let's say it's a dog that's doing it for sport or is happy about it. So a dog trained to protect somebody, or just genetically, they're like, I'm a Belgian Malinois, I'm supposed to protect somebody. So you might have underlying emotions, different emotions in play, all with the same suite of behaviors of barking, lunging, growling, snapping, biting that the person taking that questionnaire is going to see. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's just more difficult to study because of so many variables with aggression versus like anxiety, where it's kind of universal for us, especially as professionals? We can say, okay, we see, the signs of anxiety, the vocalizations, the pacing behavior, the type of outward behaviors and signals that we could measure as anxiety, if that makes sense.
I mean, when we look at how we collected the information, like, it's hard for us to extract the motivations behind it. Yeah. Although that was a question that I had when we first started digging into the CBARC and we were in the planning stages of this. So we did also ask another questionnaire. We called it the Diet and Lifestyle Questionnaire. And one of my little areas of concern there with the CBARC is I'd be looking at the descriptions of the behavior and the context that they specifically ask about. And in my mind, I'm thinking of some of my clients, say an adolescent doodle who is just really excited to be here, and they're a really frustrated greeter. And sure, they're lunging and they're barking and they're jumping around and they're pulling towards the other dog. But they're not necessarily trying to get that dog to leave. They're trying to get the dog to come closer to them. So what we tried to do in the other questionnaire was sort of confirm some of those behaviors. So I specifically asked people, I went for a very non-scientific approach in the answers to this particular question, because I wanted to get a feeling for how does your dog feel in that moment, or how does the owner perceive their dog in that moment. So they were asked, when your dog sees an unfamiliar dog on a leash, is he excited? Is he wagging his tail? Is he pulling towards them? So we could create this little profile of what the owner, like the specific behaviors that the owner sees and the emotions or feelings that they might attach to them. Because when we talk about behavior from like a scientific perspective, we want operational definitions. We want, when X happens, my dog does this. And we want context and we want accuracy. But I think there's also a lot of value in what the owner thinks the dog feels. Because, a wagging tail is a wagging tail. It can be a happy wagging tail. It could be a very angry and stressed and tense one. So this was actually really helpful for us, because our paper, this research, is currently out with peer review. And we got the reviewers' comments back, and they actually challenged us quite a bit on the use of CBARC and the use of these composite aggression and anxiety scores. So I went back into the way back machine to the first data that we collected there about these behaviors. And I split our entire cohort up into the high and low aggressions. We had this little matrix of behavioral designations. And what I kept finding was all of these high aggression, high anxiety dogs, they are barking, they're lunging, they're trying to move away, they're trying to hide, they're trying to ignore them. And then the low anxiety dogs are excited and they're wagging their tail. And you could see like this happy little picture for the low anxiety and low aggression dogs. And for me, it was just sort of satisfying my own curiosity. We didn't really have a plan for that information when we threw it in there. But I thought, as a trainer, I'd just like to know, if you're giving me a high aggression score, say in dog-directed aggression, is your dog going to maul my dog and kill them when I see them? Or is your dog just really excited to be there and they're just showing all of these explosive behaviors? We're actually now using that as evidence for the reviewer to say, no, actually, these CBARC scores are pretty accurate. And even though it's been validated in multiple different languages and multiple different scenarios, they still wanted us to provide a little bit more evidence that our dogs are actually high aggression, high anxiety dogs. And just having that little snippet just from my own training consultancy curiosity has actually, made sure that this paper is probably going to end up getting published. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating because you have the dog trainer side again that is so influential in making those decisions and being able to see those nuances, which makes, I think, just again, this study so unique. So I want to talk more about some of the influences on the biomes and what we can do to help some of these dogs with the information we have currently. But we're going to take a quick break to hear word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Hey friends, it's me again, and I hope you are enjoying this episode. Don't forget to join me for the 5th annual Aggression in Dogs Conference, either in person or online, from Scottsdale, Arizona, from October 11th to 13th, 2024. This year's lineup includes many incredible speakers, including Dr. Clive Wynn, Dr. Jessica Heckman, Emma Parsons, Sarah Colnice, Lori Lawless, Carmeletta Ofterheide, Jess Feliciano, Dr. Amy Cook, and many more. Head on over to aggressivedog.com and click on the conference tab to learn more about the exciting agenda on everything from advanced concepts in dog body language to working with aggression in shelter environments to genetic influences on behavior. Dr. Amy Cook will be bringing her entertaining and energetic personality to the grand reception and cocktail party, which, by the way, will be live streamed as well as in person. And as usual, you'll find a wonderful, kind, caring, and supportive community at the conference, both in person and online. I also want to take a moment to thank one of our wonderful sponsors this year, Pets for Vets. Did you know that approximately 1 million shelter animals are euthanized in the U.S. every year? At the same time, many of our country's veterans are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, anxiety, and/or depression. Pets for Vets founder and executive director Clarissa Black created a solution for these problems by rescuing and training animals for veterans. Pets for Vets has a unique program model that customizes each match between a veteran and a shelter animal to create what is known as a super bond. Each animal is selected and trained specifically for each veteran based on the nuanced relationship between animal behavior and human personality to ensure a successful, reciprocal, and enriched relationship. Pets for Vets has a positive reinforcement mentality at its core for animals, veterans, and trainers. In addition to helping veterans and rescue animals, Clarissa has created a generous opportunity for positive reinforcement trainers to join our organization. Trainers are able to participate anywhere in the U.S. while receiving stipends, professional development opportunities, and maintaining a flexible schedule. Pets for Vets is also seeking new partnerships with animal shelters and rescue groups from around the country. For more information, please visit petsforvets.com.
All right, we're back here with Sarita Pellowe, and we are talking about the biome, and now we're going to jump into what influences the biome. So we talked about, obviously, things like diet, medical, antibiotics. Can you walk us through that a little bit? What are like some of the most major influences that people listening in with their own dogs should be aware of that could really mess with the biome or help the biome?
Sure. So we can sort of split it into two categories. I guess there's the colonization and the development of the gut microbiome. And then once we are in adulthood, I guess the maintenance of the gut microbiome and the environmental factors that might affect it. So when we look at where the gut microbiome starts, there's actually a little bit of controversy between scientists of how the gut is initially colonized. So if we look at the puppies when they're in utero and they're still tucked up nice and cozy inside of mom, the original theory was what we call the sterile womb theory, that bacteria can't pass that barrier. They can't get to the puppies, which would make sense from the perspective that we don't want any harmful bacteria getting into the womb and potentially affecting these puppies. So the main line of thought there was looking at the differences in delivery. So if the puppies were born naturally, or if they were born by a C-section, that would alter the initial colonization of the gut. What we've actually seen more recently is that there is evidence that the gut microbiomes do start to colonize while the puppies are still in utero. So this means that, there is actually some transfer of bacteria into the puppy's little microenvironment in there. What I think is likely happening is probably a little bit of both. So the colonization, the evidence there is pretty strong for it, I feel. The colonization starts while the puppies are still in utero, but then that gut microbiome composition is probably going to be affected through transfer when the puppies are born. If they're born via C-section, they're not going to get that physical transfer of microbiota from the birthing canal onto the puppy. What does happen, though, is once the puppies are born, the mom's colostrum does a whole lot of work of kickstarting their gut microbiome and their immunity. So what we see between around days 2 and around 54, 56, I think it is, there's rapid early development of that gut microbiome. And then there's a big switch at the major milestone of weaning. Once the puppies start to get switched from the mom's milk onto their puppy diet, the gut microbiome, again, has a big shift and continues to develop then until we think about a year old. Once the dogs are around a year old, the colony then within the gut microbiome is relatively stable. So what happens once we've reached this place of settling down on an individual's core population is we start to adjust we can adjust the gut microbiome with diet, with probiotics, we can introduce beneficial bacteria. With antibiotics, we deplete a lot of the diversity that's in there. But whenever you stop one of these supplementation processes, the gut microbiome is going to revert to its original state. So that's, I think, quite important to consider if people are looking into using probiotics for their dogs. Very commonly, if a dog is put onto antibiotics, they'll have a short course of probiotics to go along with it to supplement the gut, and then they can stop because there's no need for that individual once the gut microbiome has recovered after the use of antibiotics, which can take a few months. We had a question about that recently in the presentation of after antibiotic use, like how long does it take for the gut microbiome to go back to quote unquote normal? So I did some digging this morning and is looking at anywhere from 2 to 6 months.
Wow.
So I would suggest from that, if a dog is struggling after they've been on a course of antibiotics and it's resulted in some gastrointestinal upset, they probably want to get some Fortiflora on board, probably for a couple of months, to help the gut microbiome sort of restore itself. I like to think of it as sort of a pendulum when you're putting new supplement in there, or if you're changing the diet. So long as that supplementation is in effect, the gut microbiome has shifted. But as soon as you stop, it's going to revert back to its native population. So if we then consider potentially in the future, we might continue to use probiotics as a means of treating behavioral issues. If that behavioral issue is considered long-term, the probiotic would have to be administered long-term in order to continue affecting the gut in the way we want it to. They say as soon as you stop, the gut microbiome is going to go right back to normal.
And there's been very little research done on that part of things, of like treating behavior issues with probiotics, correct?
That's right, yeah, because we don't know what the link is first. Mm-hmm. So we don't exactly know which probiotics or supplements to throw at the problem. There is some research out there, but I have my questions about it, I guess. I mean, we do regularly use both Fortiflora and Calming Care, the 2 Purina products for dogs who are struggling. In terms of the research that they deliver to us, it's not exactly the same level of information that you might see from a peer-reviewed article. And I have no doubts that it works because I've seen it work in my clients. I've seen it work for my own dogs. Humans benefit from probiotics, like probiotics for everybody.
And you're talking about both just to clarify, the Flora and the Purina Calming Care, or?
Yeah, I've had pretty much equal results for both of them. So Fortiflora is the Enterococcus bacteria, whereas the newer one, Calming Care, is Bifidobacterium. From anecdotal evidence in my teeny tiny little population of clients here, they have both been beneficial. So it's pretty much been a case of whichever one your vet's got there, or if you can pick it up on Amazon or something like that, they are both beneficial, but it's risky there because we don't know the exact mechanisms that we're looking at. So they're still kind of in the can't hurt, might help category for me until we have more information.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if a dog has any level of underlying illness, it's definitely worth having a veterinarian on board. I'd probably argue that if a dog has severe enough issues that they are considering using a probiotic, the vet should be on board already, because you've probably discussed either a veterinary behaviorist consult or implementing some medication to help with the anxiety that they're seeing.
Okay, so what are some of the other things we can do to help? You mentioned a couple of supplements there, but you talk about often just getting out there in the natural world can be so helpful for regulating the biome and helping dogs and people.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of evidence that access to the great outdoors and getting the exposure to nature, whether that is from our dog's perspective, the items that they might interact with in the environment, or simply just from the simple act of decompression, going out for a nice relaxing walk where there are no reactions and there are plenty of sniffs and you're able to satisfy the individual's physical needs and mental stimulation. I think they go a long way to helping ease some of the symptoms of anxiety and also supporting the gut as well from reducing that chronic stress. If you're cooped up inside all day, you're not getting enough exercise and you're not getting access to the fresh air, it can't be good for us mentally, and it's likely not good for the gut either because of those long-term impacts of stress on chronic inflammation. So for my clients personally, I've got a few recommendations for them when we're dealing with a situation where, emotions are high, you're dealing with a highly anxious or aggressive dog. There are things that you can put in place. You don't have to run out and start picking up supplements. You don't have to change your dog's diet, but we do track some things to help support their gut health. Because whether these mechanisms are acting through the gut microbiome or otherwise, I have recommendations for my clients just to ensure that if you got a happy gut, you probably got a happy butt too. The happy gut, happy mind. So a few of the things that we do, we track their bowel movement scores so we can identify patterns of behavior for one, because often you'll see the morning bowel movement wasn't so great, and then they'll track their feelings about the dog's reactivity throughout that day if they had any episodes. And typically we're seeing worse bowel movements on the days where they're having a lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. But again, chicken and egg, are they stressed so their bowel movements aren't great, or is something going on in the gut and it's impacting their behavior? I also get them to track their food and treats. So if there are any new treats being introduced that might upset the belly. But there's also been a little bit more interest in food intolerances and allergies as well, and the relationships that might have with behavior. I saw a case study not too long ago, N of 1. It was only one dog, but it was quite an interesting little paper where they believed that the dog may have some level of, canine celiac. They had an intolerance to grains. So they put the dog on a hydrolyzed protein diet, and the behaviors were all but fixed. And the one time that they did actually have a re-up in the aggressive behavior from the dog was when it got into the cat's kibble. That was just one tiny shift in his diet, brought on a couple of days, I think, of aggressive behavior that was then remedied again by going back onto the strict diet. The kind of unfortunate thing there, though, is obviously it's one dog, so it is an isolated study. And when an owner in that position starts to feel better about the behavior, then chances are they're going to turn down costly diagnostics and follow-up because for them, the problem's fixed. But I think more studies like that would be really interesting. We've had, anecdotally, one of the dogs that I've worked with here in Newfoundland, we found that both fortiflora and beef liver were two key predictors of how his behavior was going to be on a given day. We started to notice that when he had beef liver, usually that night, he would have an aggressive reaction towards his family. And with fortiflora, we had him on it for, I think we did about 2 months starting off. And then the owner wasn't able to pick up another pack. Within a week, he'd reverted right back to the intense guarding and aggressive behaviors. So
wow.
I wouldn't claim it to be a scientific finding, but it is interesting to see those patterns once you start to record the information and get the data from your clients. You start to highlight these patterns, and it's just fascinating to see how it can have an impact on the individual.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I love that, again, with humans and with animals, we're talking more about diet and how that can influence behavior in so many ways, and we're definitely seeing it more in the human research and the people talking about it more, which is great. I think it's something that we've kind of, at least in the US culture, swept under the rug for quite some time. And there's obviously a lot of outside influences, which I won't get into on this podcast. But now, speaking of that, you're a scientist and you're a dog trainer. And so for me, I would say I'm just on the dog training side. Of course, I love the science, but I don't do the research like you do. And I'm not necessarily diving into papers every day. And so when we're working with clients, there's like this kind of sometimes this balance we have to keep, like, okay, we need to back things up. So this science-based dog training, we often hear that kind of term used, like I want a science-based dog trainer. And we can unpack that as well. But, you kind of struggle also with, there's a lot of stuff we talk about with clients that there hasn't been research done, or that we don't have the information from academia yet to back up what we're saying. So from your side, because you have both hats on, how do you balance that? Or just kind of an open-ended question. What are your thoughts on that? And especially for the dog trainers listening and that aren't in university research.
On a good day, I balance with therapy, and on a bad day, I balance it with wine. It's a lot. I didn't really expect my business to be quite so busy when I made the decision to go back to school, but it has resulted in, very long days, very long nights. By day, I am glued to my computer trying to write my thesis. And then by night, I'm going into people's homes and getting heavily involved in essentially being their little group therapist for their families and their dogs. So it's demanding in terms of time and demanding in terms of emotional capability as well to keep on top of all of it. And I think it's important at the best of times for us to be taking care of our personal mental health. When you're dealing with such it can be polarizing sometimes. I'll go to a client's home and we're discussing behavioral euthanasia, and then I head on down to my group classes and spend 2 hours with 10-week-old puppies. We think of sometimes I don't know how vets do it half the time when they're doing all of that within one building. They're going from one room of a euthanasia to the next one. It's the puppy's first vaccines. And it's such an intense flip for us to put on ourselves and on our psyches. And then we expect to come out the other end with no consequences to our own mental health. I think everybody who does the work that we do should have somebody on board, whether it's a therapist or a counselor or a decent support network to help you genuinely process the emotions that you go through on a day-to-day basis. Because you can't rationalize your way out of a fight or flight response when you're stressed. You can't think your way or justify your way out of burnout. You have to actively take care of yourself. For me, that sort of got triggered last year by a behavioral euthanasia case that we were actually on vacation. And it's the first vacation that my partner Chris and I have taken in, I think, almost 8 years since we actually fully left the island together.
Wow.
It was beautiful. We were in Barcelona. We just got engaged. We were having the time of our lives, spending time with my family. And I got a couple of messages off the client saying, Enzo bit me. Enzo attacked me. Enzo was attacking me. And it was escalating so quickly. Obviously, I felt completely powerless to help. I'm in another country. I can't do anything about this. And the dog was euthanized before I returned to Canada. I think it was the right decision. It was such a heartbreaking case. But as their sort of mentor and caretaker in all of this, it left me feeling like I hadn't done enough because I left the country. And, that took a decent little bit of therapy to get me past that feeling of guilt that my leaving my job for a moment to take care of me and my family caused this dog to behave this way. And I know now that it didn't. I've had a lot of help in getting past that. And one of the best things is that myself and this client are still in touch, and we've actually become quite good friends now because of this process has brought us a lot closer. But I truly think that I wouldn't have been able to overcome that and genuinely heal from the trauma that was that case if I hadn't had a good therapist who I trust on board for just to talk me through the process and show me how to help take better care of myself when I'm starting to have those doubts about a scenario. And I think I'm probably going to be better equipped to deal with that again in the future now and not quite let it impact my personal health as much as that one did.
You've summed up my question really well, because it was like thinking your academic side, your dog trainer side, but then you're talking about the human side, right? You need to balance all of these things, all these hats you're wearing. And remember that it's the human side of the equation that's the most important. Because I think we all struggle with, and I was just thinking too, as you're talking about the conversations that you must need to have, especially if you're on social media or you're having discussions or debates around certain topics, is because I find that academics, or when I see conversations between researchers, scientists, they're different. There's a different feel or tone. And sometimes dog trainers will look at it and they go, oh, why are they being so rude to each other? It's just the way they talk to each other. And it's a good debate. It's good debate. No hard feelings. Nobody's throwing names most of the time at each other. Like, it's just normal scientific debate. And when we get into dog training conversations, it can get there's a different vibe or a different feel. And so what I was thinking, like, just a follow-up question for you is, what if, somebody's talking to you and you're like, you've got your academic hat on, your science-based hat on, and somebody's like, oh, so how do you really know? Has there been any studies or research done on that, right? And then that side of your brain's like, ooh, has there been? But then your dog trainer side's like, well, I've seen this work a million times, and I know it works because anecdotally I've seen it work, and a million other trainers are doing the same thing, and I've questioned it. I've said, okay, is this the ethical, positive thing to do with this dog? So like that kind of example, right? So what is kind of your advice there, seeing that you have these two hats on, for the trainers that are maybe struggling with trying to be science-based and to back everything up they're doing with data and research, but maybe they can't all the time because, like, the biome hasn't been studied enough. So I can't be like, let's give this dog a Blautia killing pill and everything will be fixed, right? like what do you do there? So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's two elements to it there as well. I mean, you mentioned social media for one, and then there's the science-based dog training aspect of it too. The people that I respect the most, I think, within the industry, and the people who have the most valuable information to give, are not stuck in the weeds there on the comments of some argument between a force-free trainer and a balanced trainer about X type of equipment. I think a lot of the time emotions run high with those kinds of things, but I think the more confident somebody is in their field and in their expertise, the less likely you're going to see them devolving into that kind of debate. Like, there's some wonderful information out there on social media. There's some great trainers who put out wonderful videos. And I think it's really important, especially in this economy, that people have access to free information that's going to help them and their dogs. But on the flip side is the internet. Anybody can post anything that they want. And I can't help but wonder sometimes if people are seeing that somebody has a large social media following and assuming that the information that they're putting out must be absolutely correct simply because of that following. And it's kind of we've got to exercise a bit of caution as dog owners and consumers of information on social media. Like, it's a tough choice to make for a lot of people. Who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to say that is the professional opinion and they are correct? And when that comes to science-based dog training, I sometimes have a question. It was actually my supervisor, Carolyn, has had me thinking about this over the last couple of years now. So when I started training dogs back in Denzel's early days, I was what I would consider a balanced trainer. My dog had a prong collar. I was taught that if he reacted, you give a correction, you need to suppress that behavior. And if you're not seeing the behavior, then the dog is okay. Which, as I've learned over the years, is obviously not necessarily the case. And I'm a lot more aware now of stress signals and of not putting him into situations where it might be considered flooding. But when we take that to science-based dog training, I think the interpretation of that is up for a little bit of debate, because we use science to guide our decisions in forming new protocols or training exercises. And a lot of that psychology, it comes from multiple mammalian models. It's humans, it's dogs, it's mice, it's all kinds of things. But I think we can't pick and choose which science we decide to listen to, and just because it resonates with our preconceived notion of what it should be. So, without getting too much into the weeds on all of it, I don't think that you can look at the 4 quadrants and say that they are all scientific concepts, so I'm going to use all of them. There's a lot more science, especially over the last 15, 20 years or so, looking at the impacts on welfare and on stress hormones and all kinds of things, that if you're going to use the argument of science-based dog training, you have to go and look at the science. You got to spend a couple of weekends getting out and reading some papers and thinking about the methods that they're using. Is this a valid study? Should this have been published in the first place? Because not every journal is created equal. Just because it's peer-reviewed, it doesn't mean that the peer who reviewed it is necessarily the best person to be providing an opinion on it. So, you can definitely get caught up in it, and you can get quite cynical with it too sometimes, which I really don't want people to do. I don't want that to be people's take home from this comment about science-based dog training. But I think if you're going to use that term, you should probably justify what you mean by it. And on a personal level, you should definitely be actively involved in doing your research on the scientific literature, so you know what science you're referring to when you say that.
Well said. Very well said. And I think it's a great way to wrap up the show as well. Sarita, where can people find you and what are you up to next?
So if you want to come check out our happy little East Coast family, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, East Coast Canine Dog Training. We also have a website, www.eastcoastcanine.ca. Next steps for us, I am finishing up my thesis, so hopefully by the time this airs, I'll be able to say that I have finally finished. And we are also looking into the possibility of setting up our own little clinic here. I am going through the process of trying to start East Coast Canine Dog Training Academy, where we hope to be able to expand our services and offer an indoor location for private training as well.
Wonderful. Sarita, this has been an excellent conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
I truly enjoyed this conversation with Sarita, and I'm really excited to see where science takes us on this topic in the next few years. I'm hopeful that as we continue to make connections between behavior and the biology of dogs, we'll be able to have more options to help dogs with aggression. And don't forget to head on over to aggressivedog.com for more information about helping dogs with aggression. From the Aggression in Dogs Master Course, 2 webinars from world-renowned experts, and even an annual conference, we have options for both pet pros and pet owners to learn more about aggression in dogs. We also have the Help for Dogs with Aggression bonus episodes that you can subscribe to. These are solo shows where I walk you through how to work with a variety of types of aggression, such as resource guarding, dog-to-dog aggression, territorial aggression, fear-based aggression, and much, much more. You can find a link to subscribe in the show notes or by hitting the subscribe button if you're listening in on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening in, and as always, stay well, my friends.